Hello, welcome back to another horror film review. Today I'm reviewing Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. One of my favorite, not just horror films, it's in my top 20 horror films of all time. Well, actually, my films, not horror films. I made a mistake there. It's in my top 20 films. It's in my top 5 films. For horror films, actually, it's my top 2. It's in my top 3. No, it's my favorite horror film of all time. Some people might say it's not scary. Some people might say, hey, there's not enough gore. That doesn't make a horror film. Now, there's films nowadays with jump scares that are actually effective. But this film is the true example. This is the definition of a horror film. And a lot of psychological horror films are some of the best. One of the most modern examples is The Babadook. Nothing like The Shining, but almost a masterpiece. Mostly because of the lady's performance that's Oscar worthy. Jack Nicholson, his best performance in my opinion. And yet, no Oscar nomination. The Oscars refuses to give horror films any love, even though they're some of the greatest films of all time. In my opinion, this is one of the greatest films of all time. This truly is one of the greatest horror films ever. It's my favorite Stanley Kubrick film, and yes, there's some Stanley Kubrick films that I love, but not as much as The Shining. All the performances for me are amazing, and I know a lot of people hate on Shelley Duvall for this performance. They think she's bad. And honestly, that's absolutely wrong, even though it's their opinion. She is fantastic in this film, and also what makes Jack Nicholson so good is because she's so terrified. And Stanley Kubrick was actually bullying her a lot, so she technically was terrified of him, so he really made her act well. So, I don't know if there's too much people that agree with me, but I think her performance is fantastic. And the kid, it's one of the greatest child performances of all time. Maybe the best in any horror film of all time. The Shining is one of the most perfect movies, in my opinion, ever made. For me, the cinematography is the opening shots are some of the most perfect shots I've ever seen. It's one of the greatest scores in any horror movie, in any film ever made. The editing's great, the visuals are ridiculous, as I said. The dialogue's pretty good. I wouldn't say it's the best dialogue in a movie, but it's pretty damn good. It's one of the scariest movies. There's chillers, everything. Like, everything in this movie is just... And the hidden details, every time you watch, you always see a detail. And Stanley Kubrick was ridiculous for details. He's one of the greatest directors of all time because he just puts everything into a movie. The details are ridiculous. All the performances are great. Everything. There is not one thing. Now, I know Stephen King hates it because it rips off the book. Now, that's the unfortunate thing, is he just ignored the book. Now, I would understand. If I was a writer of the book, I would hate it. But Stephen King apparently admits that it looks pretty good and it's actually well made. So he basically says, yeah, it's really good, but it rips off the book. It doesn't do anything like the book. Apparently it was a miniseries, but apparently it wasn't good. Because I don't really hear much about it. It was in 97, I believe. But this is the classic. Everybody talks about this film because it is that good. The Shining is that good of a movie. The Shining is truly a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest films ever made. And Stanley Kubrick made a film in almost any genre. He made comedy, he made science fiction, he made a couple war films. He made, he would make, crime thriller, but when he made horror, he truly, he made the horror when it mattered. Like, The Shining, he made pretty much the best horror film he could ever make. I don't think a horror film's ever going to get better. Now, there was a sequel called Doctor Sleep. That was impressive. Nothing like The Shining, but it was one of the best horror films in a long time. It was one of the best. It might have been the best horror film of that year. It's one of the best horror films probably of the decade. Doctor Sleep was pretty scary. In fact, the kid from The Shining is actually the star. But The Shining is it's a masterpiece. It's, in my opinion, the perfect horror film. And if you haven't seen it, you gotta see it. It's my favorite horror film ever made. And there's a lot of horror films that I really love, but this one is the best. And I'm sure you've seen the parodies, you've seen everything, but I'm not going to spoil anything. I haven't really spoiled anything at all. Because if you haven't seen it, I can't spoil it. It's too good. It's way too good. A lot of Kubrick films you can't spoil. A lot of Kubrick films, it's hard to even review Kubrick films because there's so much crazy stuff that happens in Stanley Kubrick films because he is one of the greatest directors. He only made like 13 films, but most of them are memorable and most of them are masterpieces because he's Stanley Kubrick. And he only made one horror film. Some other films feel like they have horror in them, but this is the only one he made. And yeah, so if you haven't seen it, please see it. The Shining from 1980.